Here in chapter 20, starting with our infectious diseases of the nervous system, looking first at the barriers and the defense within the nervous system. So the nervous system has two main parts. It has the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then it also has the peripheral, which is going to be essentially the nerves that extend from the brain and spinal cord. If we look at those just a little bit more, we see, of course, the brain is housed within the skull for protection, and then the spinal cord is protected in the spinal column. Both of those are going to provide some structural defense. We'll come to in just a second. And then the brain is also, besides being covered by bone, is covered by some layers that make up the meninges. And so whenever we talk about meningitis, it's an infection within those layers. And the meninges is divided into three layers. The outer is called the dura mater. Then inside of that is the arachnoid, and then the pia mater. And those three layers comprise of the meninges. Again, these cover the brain and the spinal cord to provide some type of protection and covering of that system. All right, within the brain and the spinal cord, there's a fluid called the cerebral spinal fluid, and this fills spaces in the brain. So the majority of the brain, of course, is made up of tissue, but there are some spaces called subarachnoid space or ventricles as well. Those are going to fill with this fluid, and it's just a serum-like fluid that should be clear. Again, if that's removed and it's not clear, it indicates some type of infection. The main roles of this cerebral spinal fluid is providing nutrition. It's also providing cushion for the brain and spinal cord. Again, as I just mentioned, meningitis would be an infection within the layers of the meninges. So we look at the defenses that we have. Again, as I mentioned, they are mainly structural. So that's going to be the skull that covers the brain, or the spinal cord that's housed within the spinal column. So those bones around it protect against traumatic injury. Again, the cerebral spinal fluid cushions against impact. And then it also has the blood-brain barrier. And that blood-brain barrier is really just a layer of cells that surround the blood vessels around the brain. So again, the meninges cover the entire tissue. This blood-brain barrier covers or is cells that surround those blood vessels that come into the nervous system. And the reason it's called a barrier is because it allows very few molecules to pass through. Now it does have freer passage of ions because sodium and chloride ions are very important in how the brain functions. So those need to be able to move freely. Sugars, so glucose, that's going to provide the nutrients. The brain completely depends on sugars for energy. So those need to be able to get in, as well as some other metabolites that would help for energy. But for the most part, a lot of, compared to like a regular cell membrane throughout the rest of the body, the blood-brain barrier, those cells are more compacted. They're more, they have stricter passage for molecules other than those just mentioned. And particularly talking about micro, that blood-brain barrier is going to prevent more microorganisms, going to prevent them from passing in than, say, the other parts of the body. Doesn't, of course, mean nothing can get through it, but it does help to limit it. Then also kind of on the other side, though, it does make it harder to treat some of these because the blood-brain barrier also prevents some different drugs and antibiotics from getting into the CNS if needed to fight those infections. There's also what's referred to as immune privilege inside the central nervous system. And this just means that it has kind of a different or only a partial immune response. And the reason for this is, of course, we don't want to have an infection in the brain. We want to be able to defend against it. However, because the CNS is so vital, it could be damaged by just kind of a normal immune response. So if we think about inflammation, and as we move through some of these diseases, the immune system could kind of easily get rid of the bacteria, but of course the normal response of the immune system is inflammation. And if we think about the brain becoming inflamed, the inflammation itself can be more harmful than a bacteria that may be in there. So to limit that kind of immune response, or that the amount of inflammation seen in the CNS, there's this immune privilege. And to go along with that, how that's accomplished is that cells within the CNS have lower levels of those MHC. Remember, those are the ones that present antigens. So all cells randomly present molecules from inside. That's how we recognize viral infections. But then the phagocytic ones also express or present things that they have phagocytosed and taken in. So the cells are still there. We still have the MHC1 and 2 molecules. It's just they don't present as often. So again, it's less likely that the immune system would become activated. It's a little harder to activate it. And there are also fewer complement proteins, and those activation of that complement system, again, we get inflammation, we can get increased phagocytosis, fever, all of that kind of response. Those are there. So again, there's still the immune system inside the CNS, but it is harder to activate than elsewhere in the body. And then specialized immune cells. So there are a different type of cell in the CNS called microglial cells, and these are phagocytic cells, like our macrophages that are taking in stuff and presenting them. But in the brain, we also have these microglial. There are brain macrophages. Again, they also go through phagocytosis, so there are some in there. But compared to other tissues in the body, they have fewer phagocytic, wow, struggling with that word today, cells in the body to go through phagocytosis and present those molecules. And again, even the brain macrophages and the microglia that go through phagocytosis, they're going to go through that less often than other parts, other cells in the body. All right, and then I just wanted to go ahead and introduce this picture here. It's one of the last ones in the PowerPoint, but I think it's a good place to start. Again, this is just that summary figure that shows all the different bacteria, viruses, the protists, fungi, and here we're going to talk about prions. So this is the only system we'll talk about prions, because they only affect the central nervous system. But again, I just like these summary figures. They're good for knowing, how many different viral infections there are. Of course, the majority are going to be viruses and bacteria that we'll be talking about, and just the different types of diseases. So encephalitis is one of the main diseases. So we'll kind of divide up diseases based on encephalitis and meningitis that affect those meninges. And then just some others diseases like rabies, the Zika virus, tetanus, African sleeping system sickness, botulism, polio, and then again our prions up here. So kind of divided into 3 sections. So we have meningitis that we'll talk about, encephalitis, and then other diseases in the nervous system.